Welcome to the live internet studies. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi, and I am the teacher for these particular studies. I usually go through two segments in the hour and a half long time that we've allotted. The first segment is Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We're studying end-time topics. You can see on your screen right now there are 18 different topics. We're right around the middle. We have topic 10. We're talking about the rapture right now. We're working our way towards the book of Revelation, but we're parked out on one of the more interesting topics that grabs people's attention whenever you mention eschatology or book of Revelation or anything related to end-time events. Rapture is a big topic in there. Perhaps it's because there are so many different views on rapture, and all of us are sure that ours is the right view, right? That's the nature of the discussion we're having. Of course, we can't all be right, and the good news is that we neither really have to be right, nor are all of our views entirely heretical. So, it's different when you have views on Messiah. You can border on heresy when it comes to understanding God and Messiah and the Holy Spirit. But really, there's nothing heretical as far as I can understand about having a rapture view that's radically different than someone else. Really, as my understanding is of this particular topic, you need to focus on the major on the majors and minor on the minors. And some of the majors include the question of whether or not you believe there is a rapture. Well, if you define rapture as resurrection, meaning God is going to send his son from heaven one day to, at the same time, rescue us or catch us up to be with him, yet at the same time transform our bodies, whether you're alive or whether you're dead or alive, whether you're alive or dead, transform our bodies to be like his. Well, the Bible is unambiguous that there will be a resurrection. It's all over the Old Testament. It's all over the New Testament. You really should be looking forward to the day of the resurrection. When that happens, that's a different story. So the major is, yes, there is a resurrection. And to the degree that I understand that the resurrection coincides with the rapture, then we can say that there is a rapture. At the same time, we don't know when. We don't know when it's going to happen. But that's where we need to have grace and mercy for other people who think differently. There are about 4 main rapture views that we have been looking at, and we'll turn to them here in a moment. The second part of the study of this hour and a half is dedicated to an apologetic part known as a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. And in that part, we're looking at verses that are supplied by a non-Trinitarian Christian denomination known as Biblical Unitarian. And they've got a website with resources that shows different verses that historically have been understood by Trinitarians to be references to the triune nature of God. But they are challenging all those verses, and they're trying to get you to jump ship, if you're a Trinitarian, to come over to the non-Trinitarian camp and look at all the verses and rethink them and come to the understanding that no, you don't have to have a Trinitarian understanding of God to be able to accept his Messiah and to understand the Bible correctly. So we're looking through all those passages, and we've worked our way up to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, a very famous verse that we hear around Christmas time. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And Biblical Unitarian says all those titles don't have to refer to an eternal Messiah. So we're looking at that. All right, without further ado, let's jump into the eschatology portion of the study. Let's jump through the different views that are prominent in Christian circles today. This is entirely a Christian topic, a Christian discussion. I've not heard of many rabbinic Jews for when I worshipped in synagogues as a rabbinic Jew for just a short 2 years back in the 90s, I think it was. I didn't ever hear or don't ever recall any of the rabbi's sermons being on anything about the resurrection. Of course, they're not going to use the word rapture, and for good reason. Number one, it doesn't show up in the Old Testament, right? It's a mystery. Paul explicitly tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:50, about verse 51, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in the twinkling of an eye," right? So, of course, rapture is not going to show up in the Old Testament, at least not in that in the describing the event that Paul's depicting in the New Testament, where the New Testament believers in Jesus are caught up bodily, those of us who are alive and remain when Yeshua comes back. Of course, it's not going to show up in the Old Testament. But another reason why it doesn't show up in the Tanakh or the Old Testament, I mean, the biggest reason is because God designed it to be that way. But another reason that it doesn't show up is because when you read, and this is a very important point I'm making, so I'm pausing for a moment before I jump into the study. When you're reading through the Tanakh and the Old Testament, and you're looking for the resurrection, which coincides with rapture, like I mentioned earlier, what you're going to find are passages that are also describing this event that we know as the Day of the Lord. The Day of the Lord, which is featured heavily and prominently throughout the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the Day of the Lord. And thus, the Day of the Lord takes that central place in the Tanakh, even more so than resurrection. Resurrection's there, but it's scattered here and there. It shows up in Daniel chapter 12. It shows up in the book of Job, shows up in Isaiah, shows up in a few other places. And that's good. I mean, that's enough to let the Pharisees believe in resurrection, even though the Sadducees didn't, but the Pharisees did, and they got it right. But the Day of the Lord is a major theme. And so from there, we're going to begin to understand that as we look at the purposes and themes of the Day of the Lord from the Old Testament carried over into the New, when the New Testament writers picked up on the Day of the Lord, that for them became the signature event that the resurrection was connected to. The resurrection in the Day of the Lord, or the rapture in the Day of the Lord, become events that, particularly when we start with Paul, that we're going to begin to see that they probably wouldn't have called it the rapture anyway. Even the Greek phrases that we're going to see also, harpazo, the snatching away, they still would have known the event as primarily the Day of the Lord. And so that phrase shows up a lot in the New Testament. The Day of the Lord, the Day of God, the Day of Jesus, that day, on that day, in that day, etc., etc. So that is going to be the way that we can kind of use the biblical reference to the word rapture or resurrection by seeing it as the Day of the Lord. And then when we get to the book of Revelation, then we've got a lot of chronology that we can deal with. So let's look at the 4 different views of rapture. When is it going to happen? And does it even matter? Should we be trying to guess? Well, on the one hand, it's not one of the major points of agreement or disagreement that we should be dividing over, the idea of when the rapture is going to happen. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to minimize the details that the Bible gives us. I believe that there are enough details that we can know an approximate season when we can be expecting deliverance, rapture, resurrection, the commencement of the Day of the Lord, which, as far as I can tell, the resurrection, the rapture/resurrection, and the Day of the Lord are back to back to one another. One triggers the other, namely in the sequence of rapture, then resurrection, resurrection, then rapture, then Day of the Lord, and then Armageddon happens afterwards. So Armageddon and Second Coming and things like that. That's the sequence that I can pick out. So let's look at these 4 views. Pre-trib rapture is the most popular of those 4. Of the 4 that I'm going to be mentioning. Pre-tribulational, pre-trib. Let me see if I've got another chart that actually just shows all 4. Bear with me. Okay, I didn't open it. I thought I did. But pre-trib rapture is the idea that there is a 7-year period of history that's still awaiting mankind. It's in the future, and it begins with the rapture. And this rapture happens right immediately prior to the beginning of the 7 years. But once the rapture takes place, almost immediately or within a very short time, the 7-year kicks off with Antichrist signing a covenant, and then that entire 7-year is labeled tribulation, but it's also known as God's wrath being poured out on wicked humanity or unrepentant humanity or those who weren't saved. The 7-year runs its course. At the far end of the 7 years, at the end, Jesus returns to planet Earth with his bride. Remember, at the rapture, he came to Earth, or he hovered over planet Earth, right in the sky, to rescue his bride, take us up to heaven for 7 years to do a bunch of things there. Then we come back 7 years later to the Battle of Armageddon to usher in the millennial kingdom. So that's the pre-tribulation rapture. The big point is that the timing of the rapture is at the farthest left of this chart. So timing-wise, that's what I'm looking at first. Moving down this chart to the view known as mid-tribulation, just like the name suggests, it is in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. But according to this chart, this version of it, the tribulation itself has a section known as God's wrath that is reserved for the final 3.5 years. So that's one big difference, is not just we didn't only move the tribulation 3.5 years down the line, we also had to redefine what is defined as God's wrath. We had to redefine that time period. Remember, the pre-trib has kind of God's wrath as all of the 7 years, but the mid-tribbers put it at only half that space. The second coming is still on the far right, so that doesn't change. Let's keep moving down the list. The other chart that we're going to be looking at quite a bit, at least for now, is the post-tribulation rapture. This is the view that, according to my research, is held to by at least 5 prominent Christian leaders and preachers and teachers, and I've been flashing their names and photos on the screen in post-production. You can't see it now if you're in the live class, but what you're seeing on your screen, you should be at least by now seeing 5 photos, reading from left to right. We have Dr. Michael Brown, world famous Messianic Jewish apologist. He's post-trib. Next to him, we've got Dr. Professor Craig Keener, who authored a book and a YouTube video. So if you do a Google search in YouTube for their name, Brown Keener, they've got Why We Don't Believe in a Pre-Trib Rapture, and they wrote a book, Not Afraid of the Antichrist, or something like that. I think the title is that. So they're both prominent post-tribbers, and both of them have resources showing why pre-trib is wrong. And then from left to right in these list of names and faces that you're seeing, Joel Richardson is the next one, third from the left, and he is the author of The Islamic Antichrist, as well as When a Jew Rules the World, and other resources. joelstrumpet.com, I believe, is his website. Very, very good resource. I highly recommend it when it comes to eschatology, as well as understanding your place as a Christian in Israel's theology and Israel's place in the Bible, your connection to Israel. He's very pro-Israel there, even working with FIA Studios, Frontier Alliance International, which is centered in the Middle East, right there in Israel, up near the border where Hezbollah is always striking out, up near the Golan Heights and things like that. So he works out of there, and so he has a very heart-reaching ministry to people in the Middle East, Jewish people, Messianic outreach there. So it's obviously he's very pro-Israel. But when it comes to rapture, he believes in post-trib. Actually, as I've mentioned, he believes in a hybrid view of pre-wrath and post-trib. And I'll flash a little graphic on the screen in post-production for you to show his little hybrid model that has a bit of post-tribulation timing, where the rapture and the second coming are very, very right on top of one another, basically on the far right side, like you can see on this screen, but at the same time, or like you can see on those other screens that I was showing. But also, he believes in what's called pre-wrath, meaning if you look at this post-trib rapture, you'll notice that the post-trib rapture and the second coming are on the far right, which means they both take place, for all intents and purposes, after God's wrath is poured out, after what we would call the tribulation period has been raging on. And yet, Joel Richardson does believe that we are pre-wrath. We are pre-wrath. He just takes the word, the God's wrath time period, and he collapses it into the last final 30 days outside of the 70th week of Daniel. So he has rapture separating the tribulation period from the wrath period. And the wrath is only 30 days long. I disagree with him there, by the way. But at least he holds on to pre-wrath. So post-trib has God's rapture and God's second coming, right? Messiah's rapture and second coming happening at the farthest right of the screen almost simultaneously. This is the view that one of the gentlemen on the list that I'm going to mention here in a moment also holds to. So let's bring up that little picture of the five gentlemen in case I made it disappear from the screen in the post. So we've got Joel Richardson that we left off with, and then next to him on the far right of these photos is Dr. Douglas Moo, and he's a very prominent theologian. Writes a lot of books, a lot of smart books. Knows a lot about the Bible, but holds the post-trib, so I don't hold that against him. Other than that, he's got some really great resources. Not entirely pro-Torah, but I don't hold that against him either. But post-tribber. And then the last person on the list, down at the bottom in the center, is Pastor John Piper, who we interacted with his view of rapture. He's post-trib as well. And a lot of his is based on his understanding of the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and chapter 5, which we're going to be looking at tonight. That's why I'm mentioning it. So we've got post-trib rapture. Let's go back to our rapture views now chart, in case it disappeared from the screen. Post-trib rapture, what you should be seeing on your screen now. God's wrath, it occupies the entire 7 years, most of it, and then rapture and second coming are at the far right, basically back to back or one on top of one another. We quickly go up, then we meet the Lord in the air as well as the resurrected saints. Then we just do a U-turn, come right back down to earth, and do battle with the Antichrist or do something like that. And then the last view that we're working our way towards, which is the view that I hold to, is called pre-wrath rapture. The name itself is rather modern, like I said, within the last 100 years. It's not as old as even the term post-trib, but as far as I can tell, looking at the ancient fathers, the church fathers, the views that they held to, they would have been premillennial, like I am as well, but they also would have believed, as far as I can tell, except for maybe two of the church fathers, but most of the church fathers believed that the church was going to meet the Antichrist. They believed that they were going to go through tribulation, and why not? Throughout the Bible, the church has always faced persecution. Why would it be any different that God would suddenly decide to pre-tribulationally remove the church out of what is arguably going to be described as the greatest tribulation period on planet Earth? So this would be a time for us to shine among the world's otherwise wicked, evil, dark people groups. I mean, they're lost, they're in the dark. We would have a chance to demonstrate our loyalty to our Messiah. So let's look at these four views, but turn first to the post-trib view. That's what let's only back up one in our chart. We've been kind of looking at this one first. We looked at Pastor John Piper, and he says that the timing of the rapture is post-trib, based on 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. And when we bring up those Bible passages, let me just show them to you. Here we go. So here's 1 Thessalonians 4. And when you read down through the passage, starting in around verse 13, Paul definitely pens these words to the Thessalonian church as an answer to their concerns about what's going to happen to those who have died and were believers. And so he lets us know in no unmistakable terms, right? This is not really a disputed matter, that there are those who have died in Christ, and there are those who will be alive when Christ comes, and both of us will be gathered together to him. Starting in verse 16, the famous, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first," meaning sequentially before those of us who aren't dead. And he makes this clear in verse 17 when he says, "Then we," let me scroll it up a little so you can see both like that. "Then we who are alive," verse 17, "we who are alive who remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, so we will always be with the Lord." And then verse 18, "Therefore comfort one another with these words." So this is a resurrection passage, unmistakable, no way around it, right? This is resurrection. This is the sequence of the letter written in this particular order. Remember, there were no chapter breaks, no verse breaks. So as he's writing his letter, he would have naturally written what today to us is chapter 4, and then moved straight into chapter 5. And we've got in our Bibles this heading that says Day of the Lord, but it reads, "Now as to the periods and times, brothers and sisters," starting in verse 1, You have no need of anything to be written you. And then he says, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord is coming, just like a thief in the night. When they are saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them like labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But I'm reading the whole thing because it is relevant. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day, for we're not of night nor of darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do. This word sleep here doesn't mean die. He has two meanings of the word sleep in his letter here that he uses kind of back to back. And we have to know that that's what he's talking about when he uses the word sleep. In fact, he uses it kind of ambiguously later on down in the chapter we'll see here. But he says, so let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. So he's not talking about being dead or alive there. He's talking about being spiritually asleep, or even if you're a believer, you can have a bit of carnality in your walk with God to where your senses are dulled to spiritual things, even though you are truly a Christian. You're not walking in the power and fullness that you should be. That could also be included in his admonition to stay awake, stay alert, stay sober. Verse 7, it says, for those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who are drunk, get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, let's be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation, reminiscent of his armor terminology that he uses in the book of Ephesians chapter 5, putting on the armor of God, right? Or chapter 6, I believe it's chapter 5 or 6, one of the two, but it's Ephesians. Then he continues in verse 9, for God has not destined us for wrath. Notice the context of his including this phrase about that we're not destined for wrath, but obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ is given within the context of already describing what is recognized as Armageddon or Day of the Lord language. Earlier, he talks about that the day of the Lord is coming, just like a thief in the night, and while the world is saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them. And notice he switches in his pronouns between us and them. So we know he's talking about the world around us, the unbelievers. They're the ones who are going to be caught in this sudden destruction that he calls it, and it will overtake them like a thief. But for those of us who are not of the world, those of us who are believers, those of us who are children of the light, this day will not overtake us. What day? The day of the Lord. But he just got through talking about the rapture. So the day of the Lord and the rapture are these synonymous topics, or they're very close next to each other, at least in his writing. We could even say that the rapture is first, because that was what he wrote about in the previous chapter. Remember, it wasn't the chapter break in Paul's writing. It was just one big long letter. But for us, it's a chapter break, so I have to mention it as chapter 4. So chapter 4, he talked about rapture/resurrection, and then he moves immediately into this topic of day of the Lord. He wouldn't have used the word rapture, but he did talk about resurrection, and then he turns around and talks about the day of the Lord. So that's the time frame for him is probably back to back, and this makes sense given what we already know about the way Yeshua describes these two events as well. Remember, we're talking about a time frame that is near the beginning of the day of the Lord, not near the end of the day of the Lord. Remember the chart that I talked to you about. No matter how long you slice the day of the Lord up, there's an event at the beginning of it, and then there's an event at the end of it. Everyone knows that Armageddon is not the rapture. Everyone knows that resurrection and Armageddon are two different events. Even the post-tribbers know that. They know that they're two different events. Even though they put them very, 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 very close to one another, there are still two movements. First we go up and then we come back down. There's no way to get around that aspect. So I don't know why post-tribbers shy away from this idea of highlighting the two movements or the two directions that we go, the up then the back down again. Yes, we agree that there's one event known as the day of the Lord, but looking at 1 Thessalonians 5, we finish with Paul saying, since we're of the day, verse 8, let's be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, as a helmet, the hope of salvation. Verse 9, for God's not destined us to wrath, but obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. Which wrath is he talking about? Well, he always has what we might consider the final ultimate punishment from God that sinners are going to experience because they have rejected the truth, they have rejected the Messiah, and therefore, ultimately, separation from God awaits them. That is the final wrath, the end of all of humanity's picture in that regard. It will be wrath, separation from God. But within Paul's writings, he is also introducing this idea of eschatological wrath. What is that? It is day of the Lord punishment, which is, for all intents and purposes, it's punishment while you're still alive. So it's not the after you die wrath that Paul has to be talking about. I've heard some post-tribbers kind of push that argument. I know Joel Richardson also pushes that perspective. But I don't want to say that he's wrong that Paul is talking about eternal wrath, because Paul can be using both of those themes when he writes the word wrath here, because he actually kind of juxtaposes it with salvation. And in that regard, yes, that would be true. We could say that those who are believers in Jesus have eternal salvation to look forward to, and those who are outside of Messiah have eternal wrath to look forward to, if you want to use that same language. However, because Paul just got through talking about day of the Lord and destruction on the wicked who cries peace and safety and things like that, there's no reason to rip away wrath here from that context. We can actually locate it once again with this wrath being poured out on unrepentant sinners while they are still alive here on planet Earth. So it's not the eternal wrath, but it is the wrath of God poured out as punishment against unrepentant sinners. And that's what we're saying that God has not destined us for, but for obtaining salvation. And then the word salvation would also change in its nuance to not just eternal salvation at the far end that is awaiting us, but it could also include the temporal salvation, which would of which the event known as rapture would be a great description of, right? Salvation from the Lord, whether we're being snatched out of harm's way or whether Israel is going to be sheltered in place and protected supernaturally like God did during the plagues of Egypt. And then verse 10, this Jesus Christ who died for us, to whether we're awake or asleep. And there, when he says awake or asleep, we'll live together with him, I think he returns, excuse me, to his classic sleep or awake language, referring to whether we're alive or whether we have already passed away when Jesus returns. So that whether we are awake or asleep, we will live together with him. I think that's what he means by context, meaning we're both believers, and whether we're caught up bodily and transformed in the twinkling of an eye because we're alive, or whether we're resurrected and receive a new body, then thus awake or sleep. And then third, verse 11, again, the same thing as he mentioned in the previous chapter. Therefore, encourage one another. He uses that word encourage, just like he did in the previous one. Comfort one another, encourage one another, synonymous words. Encourage one another and build one another up, just as you also are doing. Okay,